Hello and welcome everyone to the second webinar in our 6-part series, Preparing for the Strengthened Aged Care Quality Standards. Today we are focusing on getting your training system ready for an audit. Thanks for joining us today. Let's begin. So first I just want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung and Gadigal peoples, paying our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to those that have shared knowledge, wisdom and care across the generations. A little bit of housekeeping for us before we get started. So you can post your questions in the chat box at any time. We'll try and answer them live. This session is being recorded and we will send you the link within about 48 hours max, so you can revisit it or share it with the team. Now, we'll also be covering some topics today on competency-based management, but just very, very briefly, because I want to give that topic the respect it deserves, and that is the focus of our May webinar. So that's our housekeeping. Introducing your presenters, it is my pleasure to first welcome Michelle Wickie. Michelle is the Chief Customer Officer at AusMed. She leads a team dedicated to providing exceptional customer experience. It really is exceptional. Michelle has led the design and implementation of a capability framework for a workforce of over 5,000 people, providing critical training insights for strategic planning. Michelle is passionate about practical, impactful learning, and she really does focus on making training more effective and accessible. We also have Dr. Karen Patterson. Karen is AusMed's inaugural Chief Nursing Officer, and she leads our clinical governance and workforce capability strategies. Karen brings a distinguished career in health leadership, governance, and workforce development, and extensive experience in clinical excellence, regulatory compliance, and professional development. So we welcome Karen. And I'm your host and presenting today. My name is Zoe Yule. I'm an intensive care nurse and also head of community at AusMed. I've worked at AusMed for over a decade now, but also internationally in nursing professional development, setting the scope and standards for practice for this role. And I lead AusMed's accredited provider unit. So it's the only Australian education provider accredited with distinction with the American Nurses Credentialing Centres Commission on accreditation. And we've had that role for 13 years. Okay, so our agenda for today, we've got 6 sections. First up, we will just very briefly reinforce why we need to get ready for your first L&D audit now. And you're all here, you all understand the importance of that. We'll then look at the evidence items that might be requested during an audit that specifically relate to training topics, and then moving into those other evidence requirements that relate to the education and training system, your processes, and then specifically look at Action 2.95, where we look at what an effective training system actually looks like and how that will be audited. And then to finish us off, Karen is going to look at the role of a workforce strategy and the governing body, and we'll end with some supporting resources and Q&A if we've got the time. Okay, let's begin though. So you're all here, right? You all understand that we really do need to be thinking about audits now. With the new strengthened standards being delayed, we know that there's no grace period. So starting now really does matter. We've got to be audit ready from day one. Additionally, the audits are changing. They are going to be tougher. They'll be different. And our new regulatory model is focused on assessing outcomes. Additionally, we have new leadership at the Commission. We have a new Commissioner, Liz Heffron-Webb, and as most new leaders that enter a senior position will tell you, there is a real opportunity or bias for action when first commencing in this role. There are significant education and training implications of the strengthened standards and the new Aged Care Act. Now, these come from a deep focus on improving quality care, and it introduces significant new requirements. So if you were with us last year for our webinar series, we looked at this across a 5-part series. So we're touching on it in one webinar today, but it really is essential to think at the background to why training and education are so important. So some of the changes that really validate the need to start preparing now relate to the new audit model and grading. So a couple of details here to just briefly touch on. Providers are going to receive a conformance-based grading. So that means compliance isn't enough. We are also seeing a new 3-phase audit process, and there is a heavy emphasis on evidence gathering. That's seen in stage 1, the audit preparation phase, and stage 2, which is the audit delivery or on-site phase, where auditors will actually enter your provider and facility levels. The new audit model isn't just about checking if staff know something, it's about understanding and assessing whether they're applying it in practice. And finally, there's some new regulation that we're seeing come through, and that's, I think, driven by the fact that we're largely working with, at this stage anyway, an unregulated workforce. Unlike the acute care sector, where we have registered nurses and enrolled nurses, that we have a national board and AFRA that govern our work, we have a largely unregulated care workforce. So what we're seeing is that the worker's capability is actually being regulated by proxy through the provider. So a key point just to begin here is that what we're seeing in the new standards isn't just a list of training items. There are specific training items, and we will give you those. But the bigger picture is that there's a fundamental change in how audits are working, and that's driving this need for education and training, and it's coming top down from the new Aged Care Act. Okay, though, so we will now look at what evidence might be requested during an audit that relate to specific training topics. So I've used AusMed's audit readiness tool to identify these specific items that relate directly to training, and I've analysed it from both a topic and system perspective. So we'll post a link in the chat now. If you haven't got a copy of the audit readiness tool, we can send one out to you. But this is information I've taken directly from that, and hoping to distill that and summarise and help you make sense of it. So I have actually read all 1,200 plus evidence items across the 21 themes. I think it was 130, 134, something like that, pages of the evidence mapping framework. But I knew when reading through this information, to try and boil it down into something meaningful and digestible, I needed to first establish a criteria to evaluate what audit requirements actually required training or education. And the criteria that we've developed is looking at three different mentions of training and education. The first is a direct or explicit training requirement. And what that means is, in the list of all of the possible evidence items, in that evidence item, there was a really clear description that stated the need for training. And I'll give an example in a moment. The next criteria was an indirect or an implicit training requirement. So what that meant was that in the evidence item listed, there wasn't a direct word for training or education or trained or trains, but we could assume that a degree of training, education, information, or dare I say just knowledge or skill was assessed as being necessary in meeting that requirement. Again, I've got some examples coming for you. But the last one was no training required. And there are hundreds of items, you'll be pleased to know, from the evidence mapping framework where training isn't required. So this was where evidence, so that particular item of evidence could be met without a need for training. And often it relates to a document or record. So I've used incident management here as an example to help understand this criteria. So we're looking at trying to understand what evidence can be requested during an audit, and what's the basis for those. So you'll see red here is a specific training or instruction provided to workers on incident management. So that's what we've classified as a direct requirement. This evidence piece is clearly requesting to know what training or instruction has been provided on this particular topic. An example of an indirect or an implicit requirement is the middle one in green. How do you encourage individuals, families, or carers to report incidents? So this particular evidence type is worker feedback. It's not directly stating that training is what's being audited, but we could assume that training is going to be beneficial in supporting carers how to do this. So if you take the worker, providing them with an understanding through training, let's say, information, policy or process, or this is our reporting process, this is how we can communicate that to individuals and to their carers, would be improved, let's say, through using training. So that's an example of an implicit example. And then finally, the grey, committee and meeting records in which trends and incidents are discussed. There is no need for training for this particular evidence item. They are looking for a document or a meeting record. So if we break down the numbers, there are 52 must-have items. So there's 52 examples of evidence items that will directly ask for a training or education material. But there are over 700 plus items where training could be seen as beneficial, and 400 items in total that don't have a need for training or education. So we're going to look now at those 52 must-have items. What you're seeing here are a summary of insights. So when we send the link to the recording for this webinar, you will get a copy of the must-have training item checklist, and you will be able to view all items on here from both a training topics and a system and process perspective. So you will get that list, but just touching on summary here. So as I mentioned, we've got 52 unique training items listed, and they sit across 15 unique evidence categories. So if you're familiar with the audit readiness tool, you've got 21 different themes or categories that sit at the bottom of your tool, and we're seeing evidence related to training or these direct training requirements in 15 of them. So, a good chunk of those themes are requiring a training evidence. In terms of the evidence type, there's about 24 items, I think, relating to management feedback. So that's quite substantial. That's you guys here with us today predominantly. There's 19 specific references to documents and records, and there's 6 items, interestingly, that relate directly to worker feedback. So one of the examples of this, and we'll come to it in more detail towards the middle section of the presentation, but an auditor can walk in to a facility and ask your staff, are there any areas where you'd like to do more training? They can also ask individuals. So individuals now is how we're referring to residents, clients, or older people. In the February release of the updated strengthened standards, there was a very clear shift in that terminology. So I'm clarifying to begin with, but I will from now on refer to individuals. So an auditor can walk into a facility, into a home, and also ask an individual, do you feel that the workers who provide you care and services do a good job and are well trained? And there is specific governing body feedback as well that can be requested. So in terms of actual topics that can be requested, again, I just want to remind you, we will send out a PDF with the training item checklist, but here are some of the examples, and of course we've got them covered within the AusMed library. So we have trauma-informed and trauma-aware and healing-informed care, culturally safe care, kindness, dignity and respect, privacy, choice, intimacy, aged care code of conduct, informed consent, decision-making, quality of life, dignity of risk, incident management, complaints, feedback, and the others are here as well. You're looking at infection control, advanced care directives, some deterioration topics. So there are specific items where auditors can request to see actual evidence of training on these particular topics. While we're talking about topics, I just want to sort of recall a few points from our education team. Of course, we're in constant communication and looking at where are we tracking in terms of content development and making sure that in each version of the new standards that are released, that what is being requested is what you have in the AusMed library. So a couple of points to clarify. We currently have a training module on the Charter of Aged Care Rights and Code of Conduct. You might be familiar with the fact that the Charter of Aged Care Rights, we're now going to be replacing that with a new Statement of Rights module, and that'll be in the upcoming Person-Centred Care, which I believe is due by the end of March. So in the next couple of weeks, you should have that one. And so that's a specific module on person-centred rights-based care. We will be retaining the Code of Conduct portion of that module though, but they'll be separated. Next item from the team, just to communicate, is on culturally safe, trauma-aware and healing-informed care. Now, I'm sure you're aware this is a huge topic. For culturally safe, trauma-aware and healing-informed care, we've actually narrowed the focus of this because of the size of it. So for now, the topic and release date remain the same. That's mid to late April. And the focus of this module is on trauma awareness, person-centred care and cultural safety, with some really practical scenarios for caring for a person who's experienced trauma. For me, this is a big topic. I mentioned at the start, I'm an intensive care nurse. When I did my Bachelor of Nursing, trauma-informed care wasn't a topic that I learned. By the time I was working at AusMed in education, it was one of the most fundamental changes in my practice. You know, very simply put, we're trying to ask people and understand not what's wrong with you, why can't you just do this, but what's happened to you. Very important but subtle distinction in how we think about caring and working with people. And so that being a fundamental shift and change in practice really warrants a big meaty topic on that. So that's a little update for you on that particular topic. But as managers, you will continue to get the monthly content updates. We sent one out last week, I think it was, and we'll always keep you updated with new topics as they're released. So you've got some coming up by the end of March, and as always, our commitment is to make sure you've got everything that you need before July 1. In addition to those specific topics, which are actual, items that can be requested during an audit, there's some very clear evidence items that relate to Action 2.96 on competency-based education. Action 2.96 specifically states that all workers must receive competency-based training in relation to core matters. Those core matters are what you see in the box on the right-hand side of your screen. Person-centred, rights-based care, culturally safe, trauma-aware and healing-informed care, caring for people with dementia, responding to medical emergencies, the Code of Conduct, CERS and the quality standards. So they're your core matters. And what that means is that we need to be showing an auditor that we've, one, delivered education, competency-based education, in fact, on these core matters, and of course that there's an effective system and process in place to assess that level of competence and then to actually verify that a person has that particular knowledge and skill. So we're very excited to share with you AusMed Competency. It is available to AusMed customers coming very, very soon. I probably shouldn't say exactly when, as I know someone will tap me on the shoulder, but by Easter being the middle of April, I think it is, we're aimed to go live by then. And what that looks like are new competency assessment templates to assess your workforce. And again, looking at the schedule of competency assessment template development, you should have all of the core competency assessment templates ready for you by July 1. What this looks like is being able to save time. These are important requirements to have a competency assessment on these core matters, and we are working with a dedicated panel of aged care experts to do the heavy lifting for you. They're evidence-based, they're aligned directly with the standards and linked to or paired with relevant AusMed resources. The key thing here, though, is that they're an editable template. So they're ready for you to customize. You can instantly use them, but you can customize them within your organization's need. And that's a really, really critical point when it comes to competency assessment. Honestly, I'm just scratching the surface here of competency-based education and competency assessment because it is such a big topic. And as I mentioned at the start, we just want to touch on it today, but we have a whole webinar dedicated to this in May. So if you haven't already done so, please register now. I promise we will go into much, much more detail about that then. Who I'm going to switch to now is Miss Practical, Miss Realistic, Miss Simple, Michelle Wiki, who can help digest, those topics that we've said. This is what you can be audited on. Michelle's going to present now on what we can do with that information. So welcome, Michelle.
Did you like my big deep screen looking like, what am I going to talk about now? And I love that Zoe finished on Miss Simple. I think that one was the last describer. So I don't really get called Simple very often, but I'll take it this time. Thank you, Zoe. So I'm going to work through these, and Zoe's going to talk, going to press slide buttons for me, although I've forgotten, I think I've got 2 more after this. And I'm going to be a politician and go completely off script, which everyone in AusMed loves when I do that. But what I wanted to share was I caught up with a facility yesterday who had an audit, and we had talked about what they'd gone through and what's been happening in the audit space, and also whether the auditors at the moment are talking about the new standards while they're doing an audit or not. So I will preface this with my expansive knowledge that I've had conversations with an audit from 3 weeks ago, a spot audit today that I've just been texted about and we've been toing and froing, and an audit 2 weeks ago. One was a planned audit, one was a spot, and 2 others were spot audits. One was a complaint, one was based on an acquisition. So when we're talking about what's coming and what's happening, it's always nice to see what's been happening and what's coming up. And I know that kind of on my slide at the moment, we're talking about reviewing training matrices, understanding risk profiles, training plans. So I'm going to touch on those really quickly by also talking about audits. And Zoe's going to watch the time for me and give me, I don't know, some kind of notification when it's too much, although I paused my notification, so I don't know how you're going to tell me, Zoe. But anyway, so thing 1, review your training matrix. The application of this is one of the auditors said, I don't want to see your completion rate. I want to see what you're asking people to do. Can you please print out your training matrix, your orientation and your annual? What are people asked to do straight up? And what are you asking them to do annually? They want to see that the expectations of the organisation, or what are the expectations of the organisation on the learner or on the staff member. So review your training matrix, make sure that you've covered as many of your bases as possible, but you have a reason for why things are included and you have a reason for why things are excluded, and that they make sense to you. Understand your risk profile. So there's a few ways to look at this. 1, use the gap analysis tool to see where your risks are and where your gaps are. And the thing we talk about all the time with customers is, what is your organization's risk profile in terms of learning time, learning burden, some people call it seat time, and payment. So quality teams all say, do all of these items. And I've seen an organization who's really quality led to the point that they have 33 hours for an RN of mandatory training a year. Those are pretty high numbers. We don't see numbers that high as often. And then there are other orgs, same kind of org, doing the same industry stuff. They were at 5 hours of RN training time. So obviously the risk profile for those 2 organizations is different. They might both have content gaps, and they've used a gap analysis to show them where their content gaps are. But what they're doing is, one is going with a bare minimum, and then they're doing on-demand or ad hoc training when they see a gap or a clinical indicator drop. And the other is going for like no risk, everyone all in at the same thing, as much learning as possible. Now, whether they're holding on to that learning or they've got learning burden is a problem. But those are kind of ways that you start thinking, what is your risk profile? What way do we want to take it? And what matters to the organisation? Update your training plans. This really goes back to the training matrix. What have you got in your training plan? How are you doing it? And also, when you're thinking about reporting, do you have 7 training plans for a different reason, but when you need to report on that, you're going to have to print out each of those training plans, or each different version or element inside those training plans? Or can you use, if you're with AusMed, can you use a job role function, or the same item duplicated with different frequencies, so that when you report, it's all in the same training plan and you can get a clearer completion or compliance rate because everyone's in the same matrix or the same training plan. Make sure your job roles are updated. We always talk about this when someone's onboarding and HR say, well, we have 192 job roles, so you better put that in the matrix. But those are job roles in terms of function, scope, and pay bracket. A learner doesn't need to have an aged care worker level 1, aged care worker level 2, aged care worker level 3, aged care worker team leader, all in the learning plan, because they actually all have the same learning. Maybe the team leader has something a little bit more, but the ACW 1, 2, and 3 will all have the same learning requirements. So they can actually be in the same job role. And again, that will make your training plan easier for you to digest and easier for the auditors to digest and process when they're looking at what they've got. So request the AusMed content mapping and new standards, which is like my eyesight's just getting worse. I'm getting older. Leaning to look at the slides. So please request the content mapping tool and the new standards tool so that you can start to look about how you can apply what's happening in your training plan and your training, and what are we recommending in terms of the deep diving that's been happening in the AusMed background, in the back end, to find out where we're seeing gaps and where you can prepare. And I'll make 2 more comments here though. Zoe, please speak up and just tell me about my 2 next slides so I'm not talking for too long and I keep going on.
You're all good. You're on track, Michelle, and providing such beautiful practical advice. So continue.
Right. So I talked about audits and they talked about looking at the training plan. So 3 other things I want to say. The word that kept coming up is triangulation. And I said, what does triangulation mean to you in this audit context? And they said that the auditors would say to the executive or the C-suite, what is your standard 8? Now, I know the standards are changing, but bear with me. What's your standard 8? What meetings are you running to make sure the governance is running properly? And then they'd make some notes. And then they'd run off to the facility GM and say, oh, and what meetings do you have? And then they'd make sure that there was a match between. Now, that doesn't feel like a learning thing, but what I'm getting at here is there is a place in learning for you to make sure that, well, frankly, the communications between your GMs or your facility managers and your C-suite and your workers are all speaking the same language. When they say, oh, do you have any kind of learning that happens when you start the job? You want them all to be saying, we have an induction plan. We have an induction plan. The new workers have an induction plan. So make sure you're really communicating about what your learning approach is, what your training plans are, what your platform is, how you're going about it, and use the same language. So when these auditors are triangulating this information between the executive and the facility and then the learner, that they're hearing the same words and the same terminology. The 2 other things that happened, they did lots of deep diving into complaints. So if they would call lots of families. Have you had any complaints? Did you make any complaints? Have you given any feedback? What happened to it? Then they would go to a learner and they would say, what do you do with a complaint? How would you manage feedback? How would you manage a complaint? So that's where you need to jump in and make sure that your training plans and matrices have information or learning modules on managing complaints. And then they would triangulate and go to that care manager or facility manager level and then say, what are you doing with your complaints and what is your process? And they're looking for them to be closing the loop. So the complaint is made by the individual's family. The complaint is received by the care worker, maybe in the moment because it was about socks or meals or the driver, the bus driver, the stop sign. We all know that one. And then that worker escalates it and maybe documents it, but doesn't close the loop because then it's the care manager or the clinical manager, whatever you're calling them, that then says, okay, I responded to the individual's family and I told the learner what they should do next time this happened. And then I educated so that everyone knew that they had to put 2 layers of socks on Mrs. Periwinkle in room 24. And that's how we closed the loop down. So make sure your learning has information around complaints, but closing the loop on complaints and the feedback cycle. And the third thing is, and Zoe already touched on this, which is great. I love it when we all have similar information, but individual. So auditors are asking individuals, what we previously know as residents or consumers, or the families, do you feel like your staff member, carer, nurse, care worker understands this? Do they understand that? Have they talked about what they would do in this instance? Do you feel like they're competent? Do you feel like they're doing things? And what are you going to do with that? One, it's a cultural thing. Do your individual residents, I can't say individuals very well, but anyway, individuals have confidence in what's happening with their care. But one way to make that change is to talk about it. So what we used to do is have toolboxes in the communal areas. So the individuals would see, oh, they're all doing learning today at lunchtime. Oh, they're all doing another toolbox. Oh, they're all doing another lunchbox session, so that people can see what's happening and that learning was going on. Oh, they're running off and doing a quiz. Oh, they've asked me about this. And so make it really known, really commonplace, really demonstrable where that learning's happening, how it's happening, and that people are seeing that there is a thirst for information and a thirst to grow and learn in those places. Zoe, is the next slide mine?
Yes, next slide is yours, Michelle. And I won't do any animations. I guess it would just be sharing any tips for, I guess, if there is an identified need to possibly increase the amount of learning between now and July or July onwards. How could organisations think about breaking that up into something realistic, achievable, and that fits in with, as you say, the budget allocated for time spent learning?
So the other thing that came up in these kind of audit conversations was clinical indicators. Now, I've had a conversation with someone before about this, and they say, no, our learning is, and our training plans are studied and robustly criticised whether there's good clinical indicators or not. That, again, was not my experience in the last couple of conversations I've had with auditors. When the clinical indicators were looking great, the auditors, were not paying a lot of attention to the learning that would have been on that topic. When the clinical indicators were off the chart or were nearing the red zone or in the amber zone, that's when they would start to triangulate the learning. So let's say, for instance, pressure injuries had been on the line for 2 months ago, and in the last 2 months they'd gone red. Then they were starting to ask questions: what pressure injury information has been given to you? What learning have you done about pressure injuries? So what I would say, as you can see me looking at my slides again, what I would say here is, if you've reviewed your training plans and your training matrices and you have a high risk tolerance because you've got a low cost or low budget for learning, make sure that is sitting at a really comfortable base level, and then choose to run your learning based on your clinical indicators. So this site or this facility is having trouble with pressure injuries, then only run pressure injuries for that site, and take the chance, make the calculated risk that for the other sites that don't have poor pressure injuries, don't do this pray and spray scenario or just tell everyone about it. They won't hold on to the information because they're already doing a good job. So leave those facilities alone. So think about who needs it. Look at your support workers in home care. Who's actually seeing people with wounds? Who's seeing people with catheters? Who's seeing people with dysphagia? Run education targeted based on that, so that you can really put your resources into those things and pull back on them in the broad training plan. But make sure you're keeping really clear about that. Is it in an optional training plan? Is it in a targeted approach, and you're running your processes to make sure that all the right people are getting that information? So just think about, have I covered all my general training? What specific training do I need to do? And how can I run that in the most cost-effective, low-risk way so that it gets the job done, but I keep within my organisational constraints and I still meet the auditors who are going to triangulate this information. Next slide, Zoe.
That's it. Last one, sharing your wonderful team and support available to assist with updating those training plans and filtering by job roles and all of those helpful people in your team.
Yeah, so this is our customer experience team. If you're with AusMed, please feel free to contact us anytime. We've actually turned into one platform for support. So you can call a number and speak to us about individual learner issues or manager issues, or you can call your success rep who knows your business a little bit more closely than the support person. But email, we have a good email response time, we have a good phone response time, and we all do regular learning as a group to make sure we're all up on what's happening in terms of standards. I think everyone's on this webinar as well. They just all said, give us the link, because they're all learning as we learn together. So please reach out. And also we have really practical manager workshops where I go way over time and people send in questions all the time. So dial in for those as well. Thanks, Zoe.
That's brilliant. Thanks, Michelle. And I know and I can feel that really practical support that Michelle's gone through is really relevant. And Michelle, I love when we're on the same page, because I'm going to say very, very similar things to what you've just said in our next section, because we're reviewing the system and process elements or items that can be audited, and we're singing from the same hymn book. What I think is really interesting and really reinforces that is that there are actually more evidence items that relate to your systems and processes around training than actual topics. And again, I stress you're going to get a list, a PDF of these must-have training items that look at the actual topics and these system and processes. But I do want to break down these evidence items into a little bit more detail, because, as Michelle said, it's not just about showing that this is the training items that are in a plan. There is so much more to an audit and actually making this a meaningful change than just a list. So the categories that these evidence items can be thought of are your policies and processes around training, records and documents, actual systems, and specific questions. So we'll go through each of these ones now. So in terms of evidence items that relate to policies and processes, what an auditor can ask for, in addition to the induction training plan, is what are your induction policies and processes? What is your process for using training to respond to a complaint, incident, feedback, or risk? So as Michelle said, it's not just about show me evidence of training on complaints, but tell me, if something happens, what is your process to assess, identify if training is necessary? Is it necessary for this facility but not this facility? How do we make sure it is targeted? What is your process for demonstrating that performance is linked to training? What is your process for monitoring worker qualifications and competency training? And how do we use feedback from individuals to improve training? So see, there's so much more here than just give me a list of this. Now, these are very similar to what Michelle said that are being asked for in audits yesterday, 2 days ago. These are taken directly from the evidence mapping framework, AusMed's audit readiness tool, to help you get ready. And I think it's very clear that there are some trends towards actually auditing for these types of items now. The next category that we can break things up are actual documents and records. So these are actual documents and records that you can be asked for during an audit. Of course, there are training records on specific topics, but what else is there? You can be asked for a provider level training needs analysis and training strategies to ensure that workers have the necessary skills, qualifications, and competencies to perform that role. I'll come to training strategies in a minute, because I think that's quite a broad term. And within Action 2.95, we've broken that up into a little bit more detail. Parking it for now. As Michelle said, you can be asked to show your actual training matrix or similar, those training and induction records. But I just want to point out here that the role of the subcontractor and agency is really emphasised in the new standards. So an auditor can ask for evidence not just of your training records for your permanent workforce, but also for agency or subcontractors. So it's really important that you have a process in place that assesses and identifies if there's a training need or a check that's put in place to ensure that your agency or your subcontractor workforce are also trained and suitable to perform their role. Interestingly, linking that triangulation again here, another piece of evidence that can be requested is a survey of older people individuals, we're all getting used to the new terminology. I love the new terminology, but I'm also adjusting to getting that right. Apologies. But surveys can be requested. So there's a specific question as well that can be asked of individuals and their families, but an auditor can also ask for surveys to see, is there some objective and subjective data to see whether the individuals in care families are perceive that care to be provided to a safe and quality standard. I really like this one, specific, systems level items of evidence. So one particular evidence item that can be requested is what is your process for monitoring and improving the training management system? There is, of course, document and record management, but evidence of improvements adopted after a review of the training management system. These are taken directly from the auditor's handbook and can be asked for it. So I don't want to leave too much to the next section, but I am unpacking this in more detail in a second, because action 2.95 actually looks at how do you regularly review and improve the performance of your training management system. So I will come to it. But just to finish off these 4 core categories, these are critical. So during an audit, management can be asked these specific questions. How do you ensure that your training processes are effective? Your governing body, so your board, your executive team, can be asked, how does the governing body assure itself that the provider's workforce, recruitment, training, supervision, and performance management systems are implemented and effective? So what do we need to be doing now? How do we work with your governing body now to share with them what your training system and training management processes look like, so that they are all singing from the same page as well? As I mentioned before, workers can be asked specific questions during an audit, including, does the provider support you to take time to participate in training and courses? Are there areas where you'd like more training? And of individuals, do you feel that the people who are caring for you are well trained and doing a good job? So I don't want to just dump all of this information. I want to try and do, as Michelle's done with our specific topics, and think about, how do we use those? How do we take those evidence items and actually action them? And we can do that by developing an effective training program, by looking at this best practice cycle of planning, implementation, and evaluation. And that is best practice. So if you look at these 3 steps, when it comes to planning, what can you do to action, these items now? The first thing, if you're not doing it, is certainly to do at least a minimum annual training needs analysis or needs assessment, and revisit that training assessment periodically. Not just do it once at the start of the year and forget about it. Actually have a training needs assessment, regularly review it, and make sure that training assessment feeds into your training matrix, and you're constantly reviewing it, updating it, to identify new core learning needs, old learning needs that actually aren't relevant anymore, and that you've got a process in place to identify, if a new topic emerges, what is your process for then delivering some targeted training based on that need. So another key thing within the planning phase is to really ensure that the training and your training matrix aligns with the strategic priorities, and that you've got clear inputs from performance reviews, feedback from a range of, from individuals to families, risk, complaints, and experience of individuals. And you've got things like your quality indicators at a process level feeding into your needs assessment. So as Michelle said, if your quality indicator hits amber or red, what is the process that triggers that particular piece of data to then feed into a training plan? And not just for everyone, we're not spraying and praying, but within that process, identifying how do we address that particular quality indicator. Michelle touched on it, but the other key thing within planning is, regularly revisiting and reviewing your target audience and job roles. Show that you don't just understand, but you appreciate that your different job roles and different learner cohorts will have different learning needs, and you could consider facilities almost as a particular a segment of your cohort. In terms of implementation, I think this is where we look at training strategies, right? And it's really important that we've got a go-to list of activities and initiatives, not just mandatory training, that we can use to address a new gap, a new issue, a new problem, a new dip in quality indicator that comes up. Not just mandatory training. So Michelle mentioned optional training, but remember, training strategies are more than just your mandatory training. You've got continuing professional development for staff that might be registered nurses or enrolled nurses, mentoring, coaching, leadership programs, specific upskill pathways. There are many, many more strategies that we can use to support, to build the skill and competence of our workforce than just mandatory training. Having clear processes for assigning that core or non-core or compliance or non-compliance training and education is critical. And I think, I'm probably saying the same thing, but it's making sure that there's a clear process, a system, and that is regularly being followed to respond to new needs or new emerging priorities based on risk, items of feedback, your governing body, changing strategy, whatever it is, things change. And we need to have a process in place that effectively identifies, considers, and addresses whether training or education or a similar strategy is necessary to fill that gap. And, the last piece of the puzzle here is, of course, evaluation. We need to be measuring the effectiveness of the training system in a structured way to make sure we get the continuous feedback. So I'm going to whiz through this next one. I think we've still got Karen to come, and I'm mindful of the time, but I have been talking about action 2.95, and it is important to pick it apart. I've written a whole article on it, and I'll put this specifically in the email because I'm mindful I'm whizzing through a little bit. But I think the key thing is, when new regulation, new standards come out, there's new requirements. It's not always clear what that particular requirement is saying, and this is a prime example. First, what is a training system? I think we can assume that the system is a learning management system. So we're talking about an LMS, right? There's an actual action in the standards that says, do you regularly review and improve the effectiveness of your LMS? Who's responsible? I'd say everyone here, your L&D, your people and culture team are responsible. But remember, your governing body also needs oversight of this. And so it is our responsibility to communicate to our governing body to make sure that they're on the same page, because this fits into their remit as well. What constitutes regularly? What is regular? I think you could say that it is at least annually, minimum annually, if not biannually, that there is a review conducted. What does review mean? How formal is it? You could look at a model like Kirkpatrick, but I think we're still lacking something measurable if we're thinking about how do we actually review this. So again, I'm whizzing through it, but I spoke to Will, our CEO, about this because obviously we make a learning management system. I said, how would you define it as effective? And the way we think about it is in two parts. One, does the education lead to the desired outcome or change in behaviour? And two, was it administered in an effective way? What does part two mean? Well, we need to be able to deliver a high number of learning outcomes with a high completion rate for the largest amount of staff at the lowest cost, measured in FTE. So if you took an example, evaluating the performance of a training system, you could actually break it down and say you've got 34 learning outcomes, average compliance rate of 80, 5,000 staff, 0.2 FTE in L&D per 1,000 staff, and that works out to that one L&D professional could manage 170,000 training requirements for 5,000 staff, whilst maintaining an 80% compliance rate. So that's effective, right? That is an example. I'm mindful that I've whizzed through it. We'll share the link to the article, but what I'm trying to get at here is the need to look not just at the surface level of the action or the requirement, but to think, what is the system or process beneath it? Have we got an example? And remember, the standards are here to push us all forward. So even thinking about the performance of your system is possibly a step forward. And so, there's some really, really interesting examples of how we can think about that. All right, I'm now going to hand over to Karen Patterson, who is our Chief Nursing Officer, because I think we can all appreciate and agree that, training and education are essential, but how do we go beyond that? So Karen, welcome and come up to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you, Zoe and Michelle. I think I'm mindful there's already been a lot of really interesting things. I've really enjoyed today's webinar. And I love that you can watch it again. I remember back in the day when you had to hear everything once and then you had to implement it. And I would be furiously trying to capture everything and write it down rather than listening. So it's great that the webinar is available. So what stood out for me today from what Zoe and Michelle have presented is that the Strengthened Standards Guidance identifies 52 direct or explicit training requirements. But beyond these 52 requirements, there are another 700 indirect or implicit mentions where evidence of training is recommended as beneficial or explicit. So you've probably also heard several times that while compliance-driven training is important, by itself, it's simply not enough. The new standards require evidence that your staff understand and can apply their knowledge in real-world, everyday care situations. It's about genuine capability and not about ticking a compliance box. I'm going to pause and share some of my reflections. I'm thinking maybe they might resonate with you. So it's obvious, given the scale of change that we're facing, mandatory training alone isn't enough. The workforce is already under pressure. Limited time, stretched resources, expectations, the hold of themselves and held by others to provide uninterrupted, person-centred, high-quality care. So capability building is essential because it supports staff through change, making sure they feel valued, skilled, and confident as their roles evolve. Essentially, what is being asked is to build a plane while flying it. So we must ensure our people have the skills, support, and resources they need to safely navigate this change. So I suspect that everyone here today may feel a bit stretched and perhaps frustrated as you're cross-checking what you're doing against the new standards. It might feel like you're watching the new season of your favourite TV show, only to find they've suddenly changed the lead actor without warning you. You notice things you hadn't before. There's small differences that suddenly seem significant. So change of any kind triggers a human threat response. It taps into your energy reserves, narrows your focus, reduces your creativity. I'm sure you've all felt it. Aged care happens in real life situations. It's complex, dynamic, with many moving parts that can trigger planned or intended, but also unintended outcomes. And unlike a TV show, we can't just change the channel. So knowing that there are several facility, learning and development and quality managers online, I feel you might agree that in this complex real-world system, our most critical assets and essential change agents are our people. And in this case, it's our aged care workforce. It's crucial we keep them tuned in and engaged. We need a capability building approach because it's much more than just knowing the rules. It's about learning and adapting to new rules while still providing quality care. It's about making our staff feel safe, supported, and confident, knowing their daily contributions matter deeply. Compliance-driven training cannot achieve the quality outcomes that we are looking for. And the new standards clearly demand a system-wide comprehensive approach to building workforce capability. So taking a capability building approach strikes a tricky but essential balance. It recognises the existing skills of our workforce, values their daily roles while supporting them to adapt and grow through genuine practice improvement. It's about shifting from merely completing training to ensuring real-world competency. So continuous learning needs to be embedded into daily practice. For example, regularly observing staff on the job, which is what Michelle was talking about, ensuring they know what to do, but crucially also how to apply it in their daily practice. Capability building is fundamentally about people. How our staff experience their daily work matters enormously. Do they feel psychologically and physically safe, engaged and valued? Can they speak openly, learn from mistakes, give and receive feedback freely? Some practical strategies, which you've probably already got in place, include coaching, supervision, mentoring, leadership development, and those meaningful career conversations. These strategies don't just improve outcomes, they also significantly improve workforce retention, which, as we know, is linked to improved outcomes. So I've got 3 practical examples which you can realistically start with straight away or build into your existing activities. The first one is called real-time feedback loops. So short, regular huddles or team meetings that anyone can call, huddling all the players, including clinical, non-clinical, managers, and where possible, clients and carers, to openly discuss and respond to what's happening now, such as an anticipated or immediate staffing challenge, or maybe what's just happened, such as a near miss, and agree a plan for making adjustments and what we should look out for. What can we learn? Indicators that any change we've made is an improvement. Without measurement, we don't know if change has been an improvement. So structured on the job competency assessments. To engage in regular rounding, observing and coaching staff in real care situations. So rather than relying solely on that formal annual competency check, model the learning culture you are aspiring for others to adapt. And finally, an integrated digital learning platform. So using a learning management system, an LMS, to monitor training completion, track skills progression, and importantly, that triangulation linked to learning activities such as huddles and roundings to better understand the impact on daily operations and care outcomes. So to practically achieve all of this, adopting a socio-technical systems approach to capability building is vital. Simply put, a socio-technical system theory appreciates the interaction between people and technology. It's just a fancy way of saying it. It acknowledges that managing all aspects of a complex system like aged care is beyond any individual person's capacity. It recognises that sustainable improvement occurs when human insights are combined with data-driven technology. An effective workforce capability strategy must therefore become integral to your organisation's operations and performance systems. This integration enables continuous measurement, real-time risk assessment, data analysis, and those really important feedback loops. So improving your capacity to identify gaps or opportunities early means you can proactively respond to informed capability building activities. You have evidence. So rather than reacting after the fact or on hearsay. So the benefit of harmonizing your people and technology is data-driven decision-making. This means you'll have access to reliable and valid data to understand your current compliance and performance. What is? You'll also have comprehensive analysis of how things work today and clear direction on how things could improve, what could be, and rigorous practical measurement of effectiveness, evidence, which directly links capability building activities to quality outcomes and measurable care indicators. So this brings me to the critical role of governing boards. How can boards practically assure themselves that workforce strategies, recruitment, training, supervision, and workforce performance systems genuinely work and continuously improve? Boards must actively provide strategic oversight. They need clear mechanisms to regularly verify that workforce capability is improving quality outcomes in real terms. Just like you need the evidence to inform your work, the board needs the evidence to inform their strategic oversight. So the takeaways for governing boards. Strategic oversight. So the board's role is in quality assurance. So it's focused on monitoring the organisation's performance and outcomes. It looks for gaps between expected and observed performance, so your KPIs, where are you? And with the goal of ensuring processes remain stable over time through detecting and emerging problems and taking appropriate actions. A governance framework, a high-level map that provides a clear and explicit view of how your workforce strategies, training programs, and supervision systems link directly to the organisation's priorities and key performance and outcome indicators, is a practical form of assurance. This can be used to orientate and inform the board, allowing for the board to understand the many variables, your everyday life, that influence performance and to engage in targeted deep dives to demonstrate improvement over time. Taking the board with you is critical. Data-driven insights. Boards need timely access to easy-to-read, robust, evidence-based reporting. They need to see clear data linking the workforce training and development activities to genuine improvements in care quality. Data includes qualitative or quantitative sources, as we've heard, and could be verified through the inclusion of staff and client stories, their feedback, complaints or compliments, or survey data. And then finally, fostering a culture of accountability improvement. The board sets the tone, promoting a transparent culture where accountability, psychological safety, and continuous learning are standard expectations. It's critical that the board are also modelling a safe place for members of the board to ask questions or raise questions. Similarly, engaging in leadership rounding, visiting workplaces, engaging with staff and clients is a practical, effective way for the board to be assured that the data reflects the reality of the staff and the client care experiences. So conformance isn't something we achieve once. It's an ongoing commitment to systems of quality assurance, continuous improvement, and excellence. In essence, it's about asking good questions. So in summary, some 3 key points. So prioritise an evidence-based capability building approach, embedding learning and competency tracks directly into daily practice. It has to match your environment and context and have the evidence pathways to support. Clearly deploy a workforce capability strategy guided by the socio-technical theory. Not one person can oversee a whole aged care system. You need technology to assist you and provide the evidence for decision-making. Explicitly linking strategic quality priorities with measurable outcomes. And establish regular formal board processes to verify workforce strategies, quality system effectiveness, and organisational readiness for accreditation. So I'd like to acknowledge, I imagine that you already have many of this in place, and it is about cross-checking and ensuring that you're working towards the strengthened standards. And your proactivity in preparing and demonstrating commitment to quality and providing outstanding care is commendable. And I'd just like to offer, and on behalf of AusMed, it's been a great privilege to be with you on this journey and continue to partner with you. Thanks, Zoe.
Thanks, Karen. Some wise words, and I still pinch myself that we can work with Karen every day. And I think, what you're hearing is not just experience, it's not just expertise, there's a lot of empathy. Karen has walked these shoes many times before in many different roles, and we at AusMed have too. Michelle has in so many different ways. So, our webinars are just one way of supporting you. We're here to back you to, July 1 and of course beyond. Thank you for your attendance today. I'm mindful we've gone a couple of minutes over time. So I'll just quickly end with, there is hundreds more hours that we could spend on this particular topic for both Karen, Michelle and I. Education, practice development, workforce capability are things that we could talk about till the cows come home. In fact, stay tuned. There's a new podcast launching soon. Shh, I've let the cat out the bag, but there are genuinely so many resources available on the AusMed Toolbox that can support you. Look at these topics: creating an education framework, integrating research into L&D, some of the more opinion-based pieces, looking at how you mitigate clinical risk through education, when education isn't needed, because there are many times when it's not. So just really encourage you to make the most of all of the resources that we have available. A 60-minute webinar on education and training touches the surface, but there are more to come. So this was the second in a 6-part series. The next one is just before Easter, and we will continue to build on this conversation, particularly where Karen has gone, looking at how providers can demonstrate compliance with Standard 2, what evidence can be requested, linking staff performance with learning, and thinking about workforce capability more. So hope to see you at our next webinar. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to continuing to partner with you throughout the journey to July 1 and beyond. Thank you.